And on behalf of our President Director, former Congresswoman Jane Harman, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all today for a discussion we've entitled Hotspots, Population Growth in Areas of High Biodiversity. As I think a number of you in the room know, and in fact it's wonderful to see some folks who have been supporters and contributors to this topic from back to the beginnings of our program when we started in '94. In the room here today, this is a set of integrated topics that we've tried to tackle and tried to be a forum for bringing new research into the policy realm and then having the diverse set of communities in the policy realm come and talk together. So it's wonderful to welcome back some friends from those early years and see some new faces as well. Allow me just a word about the center, a repeat for some of you, but I do think because today's session so well illustrates this legacy of both scholar and politician that Wilson had. Today's discussion fits the original intent for the center on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis, bringing these worlds together to reflect his legacy as the only president to have a PhD. So we at the center have been doing that since 1968 as a program, environmental change and security program, since 1994. From just a couple years after that have engaged in a partnership and with the support of the USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health and currently under our HELPS project, which is Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population and Security project that is meant to facilitate these discussions here at the center and with many of the partners that we see in the room and in front of us. Today's meeting, as so many meetings are, is a product of having a cup of coffee. Jason Bremner of PRB and David were with me, I don't know, 3 years ago. And he said, you know, John Williams has got some new research that you're going to want to see, and we're going to want to discuss it at the Wilson Center when it comes out. And so we are here now today, in part because of that cup of coffee that Jason and David and I had a few days back. It's also the combination coming together with that axiom that perhaps some of our colleagues don't always appreciate, but you only learn if you get out from behind your desk. And so Sandeep Bathala, my colleague, and I were very lucky to meet Vic Mohan, who we will have on VTC and who's speaking to us from London. We met him in Dakar at the International Family Planning Conference in Dakar this last fall, and we're looking forward to Vic sharing what he shared with us at the time, which is a real dynamism that the Blue Ventures folks have in tackling the issues of population and the social and development challenges that communities living in and around biodiversity hotspots have today. So in some ways we will travel from the macro and some of this new research in terms of how these things correlate and come together and end up with Vic talking to us about how these are being tackled in specific places, with David Lopez-Carr as somebody who kind of sits between both those worlds, one who studies the big picture and then brings it down into some specific areas with his long-time research in Central America and particularly Guatemala. So I've given you the preview of where we want to go. I'll keep our formal introductions of our three speakers brief because we've handed it out for you. We are starting with John Williams, who again it's great to welcome him back. We had the good fortune of working in the mid-90s with John and Jim Nations, who is here today when they were at CI fighting the good fight on integrated population health and environment issues. But John is an ecologist and researcher at UC Davis. Visiting scholar at UC Davis Gifford Center in Population Studies, and also co-founder of an environmental consulting firm, Pacific Agroecology, and as I mentioned, has some new research that looks at these issues together, and we're very much looking forward to hearing from John. David Lopez-Carr is another person who has contributed from this dais before and worked here with us at the Wilson Center in a variety of contexts, sharing his research and helping us translate what that could and should and perhaps means in the policy and practitioner context. David's a geographer, professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which makes me wonder why he ever leaves campus, given its location and beauty. But he does, in part, to come out to share these insights with us, but more importantly, to get out in the field where he has for a very long time gone back to some of the very same places in particularly Central America, particularly Guatemala, to understand these dynamics. On the one hand, the population dynamics and the health dynamics, and then understand them in areas of biodiversity and environmental significant places. And then finally, as I mentioned, Vic Mohan, who's a medical doctor, is coming to us from London, and Vic's going to talk about the work that he and his colleagues at Blue Ventures are doing in the coastal communities in Madagascar, where in some ways building off the understanding from the scholarship that is represented today by John and David, are really tackling these issues on the ground in needy communities that are living in and around these areas, so they know we're talking about them. And so we're really quite keen to have you hear from Vic about how they are bringing these different issues together in ways that are helping better accomplish the objectives within the population, the health, and the environment conservation sector. So I'm going to stop talking, turn it over to John, and look forward to the conversation. We are webcasting today's event, and so what that really just means for us here in the room is wait for a microphone when it comes time for the Q&A. For those of you online, you can find the PowerPoints in PDF form on the same page to help you follow along. And I will be trying to do some tweeting. If you want to do that, you can use that at the Wilson Center or at Jeff DeBelco to try to track this conversation. Hopefully you can contribute to it as well. So John, please, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. And it's a real honor to be up here, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for braving the elements to come out here today. So I come at the population environment nexus from the conservation side, and for 30 years or so, conservation organizations have been trying to put together sort of global approaches to conducting conservation and to sort of prioritizing where they do that. The biodiversity hotspots being certainly one of the more visible ones, but certainly not the first. And just for those of you who are not quite so familiar with the hotspots, it's based on the premise that biodiversity is not evenly distributed across the globe, and that there are areas that are particularly rich in biodiversity and endemic species, those that only occur in these regions and nowhere else. And so you can see on this map that a lot of those places are concentrated in the tropics and in the Mediterranean regions and in mountain regions across the globe. And so shortly after that sort of formal launching of the biodiversity hotspots, some of my colleagues over at Population Action International, PAI, did this sort of companion analysis on human population growth and density in the hotspots. And they found that like biodiversity, that human population is disproportionately concentrated in these same areas. And so based on 1995 numbers, they found that 1.1 billion people were living on just 12% of the Earth's terrestrial surface, that the population growth rate, the annual growth rate of 1.8% was much higher than the global average, and that the density of people living in those areas was much higher than the global average, and pretty dense for areas that are supposed to be sort of some of the last refuges for unique species. And so in 2010, with a whole sort of bunch of new data, and then the opportunity to write a chapter for this book looking at biodiversity hotspots sort of from multiple angles, I wanted to sort of see if I could do an update that might do justice to some of the work that Rich Sincata and Bob Engelman and Jennifer Wisniewski did 10 years ago. And so some of these numbers are 10, 15 years old. and there was now some sort of new data on the 2000 numbers that they actually did, since they didn't have the census numbers when they did it, and so there were some revisions. The growth rates were a little slower, in fact, than they thought. And there were two new spatial data sets that were sort of real advances. First being the gridded population of the world from the folks at the Center for International Environmental Science Information Network at Columbia, and then a 2008 model of population out of Oak Ridge National Laboratories that used not just census data, but information like roads and energy use, lighting, to model where population distributions might be in an attempt to make it more accurate than census data. And so these data sets had much higher resolution than the PAI study, 400,000 administrative units versus 20,000. And then also, in 2010, shortly before I started the work, the United Nations Population Division came out with its 2010 update. So trying to take advantage of some of these new resources to revisit this relevant question. And so the analysis basically takes these administrative units and the reporting for the population, whether that be the model or the census data. It puts it into a sort of a global spatial framework. And then it overlays the hotspots boundaries and sort of either sums up for the population or looks at the average population density in these priority areas. And what I found was a map that looks strikingly similar to what the PAI study was, but with some important differences. And that the highlights are now almost 1.5 billion people in the hotspots. Higher ratio, 21% of the population versus 19. The annual growth rate, still positive, still growing, but it had dropped from 1.6% in 2000 to now 1.3%, which was a bit of positive news. And the population density still growing, so up from 73, still quite a bit higher than the global average, which had also grown. And so here's the real sort of punchline map from the study, and this shows the difference between the 2000 study and now, and 2010. And everything in blue is negative population density. So if you're trying to get away from people, Siberia is still a good place to go. But you can see that in the tropics and in the hotspots, for the most part, those are all sort of the beige to orange colors that indicate increasing densities. So the highlights, the biggest changes came from the Philippines and the Ghanaian forests, and the other place that was very high population density, but not nearly the growth rate, was the Western Ghats in India and Sri Lanka. Two of the hotspots had increased growth rates over the 2010. So the annual growth rates had actually increased. Those were California and Polynesia and Micronesia. And then the tropical wilderness area in the Congo. So there are 3 tropical wilderness areas. These are like the hotspots, but they're much larger in extent, and they don't have the same level of threat to them. So roughly 70% of their primary vegetation is still intact versus less than 30% for the hotspots. And so the average increase in density, population density, was 13% across the hotspots. 9 of which, though, had relatively modest growth in that department, less than 5%. And then 2 of them, the succulent Karoo of South Africa and the Caucasus Mountains, had roughly 0 or even negative density changes. And then here's a very sort of busy slide, but with the actual numbers for the different hotspots. But you can see the line through the middle is roughly dividing those that on the top have populations percent change that is less than the global average or equal to the global average, and then those below that are above that level. And moving towards the bottom are the ones that have changed the most, including Madagascar, which I guess Vic will talk about a little bit later. And then here's the actual growth rates and the density, and again, the very bottom, the world average. And that far column on the right, those hotspots in orange are those with particularly high density, and then the two in the middle column, those two in orange, are the ones where there actually been positive growth changes. And California, just to note, actually Polynesia, Micronesia is the only one with natural increase. California's growth rates is due to migration. So just some regional highlights in the Indo-Pacific region. It's an area from the conservation perspective that is marked by exceptional endemism. And although it doesn't figure into the hotspots calculations, it's got incredibly high marine biodiversity. Very high population densities on average, but varied growth rates. For example, the Philippines has a relatively high growth rate, whereas Indonesia and certainly parts of Western Australia, much slower growth rates. It's an area that's benefited from economic growth, and as a result has had some reduced poverty and lowered fertility rates. But with that, maybe, and this is sort of correlation more than causation, but there's been increases in the exploitation of rare species and illegal trade, probably more a factor of higher incomes and higher disposable incomes. And with that, also some increased pressures on logging. So less subsistence, but more resource use for exploitation. Africa and West Indian Ocean, a very different story. Rapid population growth. The population of the continent has doubled since 1983, now over 1 billion people. The sub-Saharan area has among the highest growth rates in the world. Civil unrest and conflict continue to be a big problem in that region, and that results in political instability and short time horizons for the people living there, which has taken a heavy toll on wildlife and exploitation just to meet subsistence needs, people moving into protected areas. Poverty remains high total fertility rates, internal migration making for instability also as a result of some of the civil unrest. HIV, still a problem. Low education, especially for girls. And minimal infrastructure, especially to rural areas, and where access of government services and schooling, especially above primary level, is an issue. And all this results in sort of higher immediate use of natural resources, charcoal, loss of forests for basic cooking needs to make charcoal, very inefficient process. Bushmeat for protein and also to supply some of the trade, but whether it's economic or subsistence, but the bushmeat sort of is still, it's a sign of that people are meeting survival needs rather than being able to have the luxury to focus on sustainability. Latin America and the Caribbean, another very different picture. A demographic transition, pretty striking in the last 40 years to an older and more urban population with much lower fertility rates. Increased political stability during that time has allowed people to have longer time horizons. Some risks remain, and especially new risks sort of in Central America and parts of South America with the narcotics issue, destabilizing. Increased per capita GDP has sort of had a two-edged effect, less poverty, but also leading to more consumption, more pollution. Higher population densities and economic vulnerability now to global trade makes some places more vulnerable. This is especially true in Central America and the migration to the United States, also the Caribbean. And so the loss of habitat is more due to agricultural expansion, and with that some climate vulnerability, not so much subsistence sort of moving in for increasing housing for the poor as it was before. The rural areas, well, it's a largely an urbanized population, rivaling that of Western Europe. The rural areas are still underserved by some basic government services, and with that, reproductive health and family planning. And so this brings me to sort of highlighting these issues of the different regions shows that a lot of these points that I bring up are not necessarily directly related to population, and that the relationship between population and biodiversity loss or conservation is a pretty complex relationship, and certainly there's room for argument that it's direct, that it's indirect, and even according to some people tangential. But this this map shows human appropriation of net primary productivity. So the use of basically what plants produce in photosynthesis going directly for human and human-related uses. So that's agriculture, that's timber, that's livestock. And if you see that compared to my population density in the hotspots, they're very similar maps. So while population is not a direct measure of primary productivity use, it's certainly strongly related, and that the tolls we're going to take in specific areas for using energy are very much related to population. And so back to this sort of complex relationship, consumption, trade, migration, education, different cultures, all these things affect how people use natural resources and the magnitude and their impacts on natural habitat. Infrastructure, political and economic stability I alluded to sort of in the conflict slide. The health, so this health development index used by the United Nations is a product of life expectancy, education index, and income. So that's another way of trying to adjust not just the population numbers, but to some of the more basic needs in relating to the environment. The distribution of population is very important. Rural versus urban, sort of there's different threats associated with each. Rural may be more direct threats on specific species in particular areas. The urban threats may be more diffuse pollution, contribution of greenhouse gases. The gender equity issue it comes up again and again. Education, access to education, healthcare, and decision-making on behalf of women is a major impact on how natural resources are used and exploited. And then this equation that goes all the way back to 1974, but I think is still quite relevant, and that is the impact is a function of population size, affluence, which is basically a measure of consumption, and then technology. And technology sort of can cut both ways, but in general, it's a positive thing, reducing impact. So to take the example of timber in industrialized nations, takes about 1.3 tons of raw timber to make 1 ton of product, whereas in developing countries, it's about 2 tons to make 1 ton of product. Similarly, you can imagine sort of the older automobiles that are found in poorer countries don't have catalytic converters, or polluting more, less regulation, whereas the technology in, say, the United States is a much cleaner burning, sort of more efficient automobile. So where to from here? It's a very there's a million angles you can approach it from, but 3 basics just on the population side. Improved access to education, especially for girls. Research has shown direct correlation between each additional year of schooling that girls get and lowering fertility rates. Improved access to health care in general, and especially maternal and child health and reproductive health and family planning. Smaller, healthier families. This happens voluntarily. It's not a political issue. People given access to these resources will voluntarily decide to go from large families to smaller families that they can feed and take care of. And again, this gender equity issue, but it results in benefits for not just for the environment, but for the family, increases in productivity, family income, higher standards of living, decreases in family size, and direct environmental impacts on resource use. And all these sort of 3 points are very much in keeping with the Millennium Development Goals, which is just basically trying to increase human welfare across the globe with some basic improvements in daily lives. And finally, the protected areas are still a very important mechanism for protecting species and for serving as, if you will, sort of the analogy to a fisheries nursery where they produce sort of numbers and safeguard species that can either be distributed elsewhere or sort of can go outside the boundaries. And sort of our stock of our genetic stock for the globe. And also conservation in working landscapes, in that we don't need to consider working landscapes, especially agriculture, as places that become monocultures, but we can increasingly value the ecosystem services and the species that are part of that landscape when we consider using it for our own use. And just some acknowledgments here. Thank you to Jeff and all those people at the Wilson Center. I also thank Rachel and Sandeep are not here. And also to thank especially Jim Nations, who's here, who was my mentor at Conservation International getting started, and really had the vision to sort of say, hey, conservation organizations need to be paying attention to this stuff, and now's the time to do it. So with that, thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much, John. David, why don't we just turn directly to you?
Thank you, John, for that very interesting talk, and thank you, Jeff, for inviting us. And it is exciting to convene several days after we had coffee to discuss this important topic. And it's great to have you here as well, Vic. And thanks to all of you on this very rainy day for coming out here. It's a testament to how important this topic is. I'm a geographer, and so scale is important to me. And I've been working on population environment issues for nearly 20 years, particularly in local areas, doing field work at the household level in Central America. Increasingly, I'm working at larger scales, and this talk that I'm about to give is an example of that. But in so doing, I'm just going to plant the seed now that scale is very important, and so we're going to have some interesting findings that I think I'm going to attempt to qualify by embedding it within scale. I want to say that this is part of really an ongoing and larger project with several collaborators. Most importantly, Alex Volev, who's here in our joint program at San Diego State and UC Santa Barbara. Alex does work on population environment and land use land cover change and modeling in Nepal and in Ghana, and he's going to be a hot commodity on the market probably next year when he finishes his PhD. This work started for me in terms of looking at this larger issue of PHE in global hotspots. Back in 2007, 2008, when I was working as a consultant with USAID and WWF to do an assessment of WWF's integrated PHE projects in Africa and Asia. And so there's a report that was published through WWF on that in 2008, and that's available at my website if you'd like to ever take a look. That was an example of doing something that it was more kind of what I had learned to do in my career, on-the-ground fieldwork. And I'll try to inflect some of this talk with some of those experiences, because it is very different when you go at the very local scale up to the larger scale. Following that, though, we sort of had this question. Well, what's going on with PHE at a larger scale? We have these different case studies we can look at. Can we make any generalities at a larger scale? And so we kind of thought, well, what would be the best data? And this is a segue to talk about also John's work, and pros and cons of the different databases out there, because no data is perfect at a large scale. This is a huge trade-off. Obviously, at a local scale, you have great richness in your theme and your topic, right? And your methods can be very detailed. At a large scale, you get spatial, maybe and temporal coverage, but you lack a lot of thematic richness. Okay, so we thought about using some of the data and that John used, and still might overlay this. And so the work that John showed, we have basically, geo-referenced complete spatial distribution globally with the CSIN products, for example, of population. Of course, pro to this, well, you cover the whole globe, right? Con is that you have to be careful at what spatial scale you can speak to, and of course, importantly, the more remote, rural area of conservation interest, the less reliable the data is, of course. So, this is a con. And another weakness to using the globally distributed population data is that it tells us something about population now. Again, we're extrapolating across space very much. But and that data is only as good as the original source data, censuses largely. What don't we have? Really importantly, particularly in global conservation areas, what we lack from this data, and frankly from census data too, is all the detailed information about maternal child health, total fertility rates, desired family size, infant mortality, all of this detailed information, which particularly in these areas that are transitioning through demographic transitions, it's pretty important to know this. Where are they now and where are they going? And to get that richness without doing on-the-ground surveys that you specifically design for yourself, there's really only one source that we thought of which has sufficient spatial coverage that we could maybe do something at a larger scale, and that was the demographic and health surveys. Con to those, and I'll show you the maps. There's a lot of countries that we have no coverage for. Okay, so again, trade-offs with the data. I also want to make a plug for Jason Brebner, who's been a big advocate of this research and who will be leading a policy brief for PRB, synthesizing our two recent efforts. Okay, so let's get on with this talk. So, linking conservation and development, a global scale analysis of demographics in high-value conservation areas. So by way of introduction, some of this preaching to the choir here, I'm sure biodiversity continues to decline globally despite increasing investments in conservation. Given limited funding, it may be wise to prioritize spending to ensure the greatest return on our conservation and development efforts. Research suggests investments in maternal and child health can simultaneously achieve both conservation and development goals. The literature on this is actually still emergent. There are not that many of us doing research on this, and it's an important topic, and I certainly hope to see more research in this area. But what research we do have is quite compelling. So what did we do with this research? We basically decided to merge the population data from the demographic and health surveys with two different approaches for mapping high-value conservation areas. One is the biodiversity hotspots from Conservation International, and the other is the priority places from WWF. And probably most of you know what demographic and health surveys are, but for the few of you who may not, it's the largest ongoing survey in the developing world, basically, on population and health. And frankly, even if you're trying to get at basic socioeconomic data, DHS is kind of a go-to place. And so then with this data, overlapping this data, we want to model how demographics in high-value conservation areas compare with neighboring areas. And again, this is building on work that I've already published with a report for WWF, where we did descriptive analyses and we did basic statistics comparison of means, which is actually, if you want to see details for regions, it's very useful to do, but I don't have time to get into that here in this talk. For this talk, we're actually doing a regression model to see if these things actually play out, these independent variables in predicting a couple of our outcome variables, total fertility rate and desired family size. So we have the DHS survey data. We take the global administrative boundaries. That's one overlay. Another overlay is WWF priority areas. Okay, so that's one analysis, and then we throw that one out, and then we do an overlay with the CI biodiversity hotspots. Put those together, do the spatial modeling, spatially explicit modeling approach, where we're doing we're controlling for spatial autocorrelation with a weight matrix. And we want to ask this question about the PHE approach. Is there bang for the buck? So very simply, in this model, we're testing two alternative indicators of hotspot priority place proximity. It's the inverse square distance to a CI hotspot or the inverse square distance to a WWF priority spot. And we're modeling here, and we have a whole mess of variables. But for this model, we're just looking at current total fertility rate in Model 1. In Model 2, we're looking at unmet need for family planning services. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast? Okay. So here are the maps of the distribution of DHS surveys. And as you can see, some countries have had several DHS surveys. Some have had none. Again, so this is definitely a weakness in terms of what we're able to do. But you can also see that, pretty much we can at least get one DHS survey in the last 10 or 15 years for countries that are within the WWF or the CI conservation areas of interest. In here are the map of high priority conservation areas. WWF in brown, CI in blue, overlaid with where we do have DHS surveys. I should also say, in terms of the modeling, DHS surveys are designed to be statistically robust at a country level. So, we're making some assumptions here, okay? And, if we have a very small sample size at a level 2 administrative unit, we're not doing that. For the purpose of this research, we feel pretty safe going to the first level 1 administrative unit, like a province or a department. So we start off with a data set of about 1,200 regions within 79 countries. And a region, I mean level 1, not all the way down to the municipality, but like, say, a department or a state level or province level. We reduce that data so that we have only surveys conducted since 1996. We take the most recent one from each country. Final data set, 440 regions from 59 countries. And here are the results of that regional analysis for total fertility rate. You can see in red, sub-Saharan Africa, over 7 remains very high. And it is as low as replacement level or close to replacement level in parts of South America and Asia and South Africa. So there's great diversity currently in the globe in terms of this demographic transition. Very much paralleling the total fertility rate is the under 5 mortality rate, where again we see in Africa it's extraordinarily high, even over 200 in much of South Africa per 1,000 births, or per 1,000 children. Youth population, again, and this is very much an indicator or proxy of future population growth. Because even if total fertility rate, or even if fertility schedules overnight were reduced to replacement level, because of the very young population in the poor countries, population will continue to grow quite a lot into the future with population momentum. And again, we see this concentration of the under 15 population, this youth dependency burden in Africa. Again, very much following these other results, unmet demand for family planning remains particularly high in sub-Saharan Africa. But this is not necessarily intuitive or expected. This is not a linear relationship. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about these finer scales. So, it doesn't necessarily go in hand that you have very high fertility, and so you also have high unmet need for family planning. What we tend to see is that in the very earliest stages of the demographic transition, and certainly there are places absolutely in priority conservation areas, particularly in areas like Africa, where the state of the demographic transition is so early that total fertility rate remains very high, and yet there is not yet high demand for family planning. And you pretty much can see in these conservation areas the whole gamut from remaining high fertility, scarcely declining, still at over 7, with no or virtually no demand for family planning in the most remote rural poor areas, particularly in Africa, all the way to places that have nearly achieved replacement level, and everything in between. Why then do we? So this is a very interesting question to ask about the unmet demand, and something that we can get the DHS surveys, which is that you might have a place that has a TFR of, say, 7, another place that has a TFR of 7. You might have in one place 1, that the unmet demand for family planning is basically nil. But in place 2, say the desired family size might be 3 or 4. Well, that's very interesting. If you just look at the TFR, you say these places are, they're equal, right, in their TFR. But place 2 shows this latent demand, and it's basically then further along the demographic transition, and that has very important implications for policy interventions. If there's unmet demand for family planning, presumably, if people can avail themselves of it, if it is made available, it would be used. Whereas in other places, maybe it wouldn't if the demand is still not yet emergent. In which case, policies more not on the supply side, but on stimulating demand. And then this would be through more, in a sense, more fundamental determinants of fertility, such as women's empowerment and education. Those would be the areas to target. In areas, again, where the unmet demand is still low. So I basically constructed an index of some of these major predictors of the demographic transition, including infant mortality rate, total fertility rate, unmet demand for family planning. Made an index to map the stage of the demographic transition. And we can see, again, very much following what we've seen before in the maps, that particularly central Southern Africa, very early stages of demographic transition. And as you can see, particularly in areas, for example, in the Congo Basin and central Southern Africa here, in this 0 to 1 in our index is basically scarcely beginning the demographic transition. So incredibly, even in this small area in Africa, we have places that have scarcely begun the demographic transition, and you go a few hundred miles south, in South Africa, for example, and you have nearly completed demographic transition, all in one, compressed area. And this is absolutely unprecedented historically. I mean, we are now going through this demographic transition in the developing world, and particularly where we see it unfolding and we see the great diversity remaining is in the more remote rural areas, particularly in and around conservation areas. Okay, so on to the models. This is our model 1 predicting current TFR. And we have WWF here in the first 2 columns, and then the CI, conservation areas, in the second 2 columns. Let's just run through these. So infant and child mortality rate positively correlates with TFR. Interestingly, agricultural employment positively relates to total fertility rate. And this is very much in line with Boserupian theory and lots of work in ag economics. What's also interesting here is that, in a sense, if you look at ag employment, it's a proxy for being in a rural area. And so if you just, for example, have divide rural to urban, that is not as fine a scale as capturing agricultural employment. If you have a household that's engaging in agricultural employment, that is not always, but nearly by definition, it's a rural area. Which, if you just rely on data that you have urban, rural, there's certainly villages and towns, and even small cities in these rural areas. And so people who are working directly in agriculture, as we find from smaller scale studies from around the globe, that does predict higher fertility. Surprisingly, the primary schooling in this data did not emerge as significant, although in just the bivariate analysis it does. Unmet need for family planning services, positively related to fertility, as expected. Wealth, as expected, again, and following the literature on fertility determinants, negatively related to current total fertility rate. The intercept's significant in both models I'll show you, and basically that's just telling us that there is highly significant spatial autocorrelation that we're controlling for. Okay, so moving on to predicting unmet need for family planning. This is the continent Asia comparing to the baseline Africa. In Asia, compared to Africa, there is it's negatively related to unmet need for family planning. Europe is not significant, not surprisingly. South America is significant and negatively related to unmet need for family planning. Primary schooling here is related to unmet need for family planning positively, and wealth negatively related. So what does this tell us? The CI defined hotspots differ significantly from the WWF priority places. WWF tends to include more rural areas, while CI tends to include more urban areas. Areas near High-value conservation areas tend to have lower TFRs than comparable areas. Areas near the CI biodiversity hotspots have higher unmet need for family planning services. But for the WWF priority places, the opposite is true. But one thing that I really do want to reiterate here is that scale really does matter. And this is a very gross scale analysis. If you look at our 2010 report and we just simply divide it out by region, you see that, for example, in Africa, so many of these things are significant in the ways that you would expect. And if we go out even at a finer scale, certainly my on-the-field experience in these WWF PHE sites and from my own research, and certainly Jason Bremner's research in the Amazon will attest to this, that in the most remote rural areas, TFRs remain high, and in many cases, in the most remote rural areas, the demand for family planning is still very low. So high-value conservation areas do not have unusually high current total fertility rates at this gross scale of analysis. We know this is not the case at finer scales. So, one of the questions that I being autocritical here is this really the right scale for doing this analysis? I think it can tell us some things, but I think that we do have to follow up and do research at the finer scales where, DHS does not have the data. The high unmet need for family planning in the developing world remains significantly higher in regions within the WWF priority places. Africa has very high unmet need for family planning services, and conservation may be less sustainable in Africa if it does not consider health, to conclude. And I want to give thanks to several of the people who have worked on this larger project. And I also would like to just conclude with one other final thought, following up on something that John was talking about in terms of the importance of MCH and women's empowerment and education, particularly for girls, equity. I tend to get quite a bit of pushback in certain circles in discussing this issue. And it really flummoxes me. And I don't know, I guess I'm putting that on the floor for comment. I'll give you one important example. I'm currently coordinating lead author for the Global Environmental Outlook for the United Nations Environmental Program. And I'm a lead author on the drivers chapter, drivers of environmental change, lead author on the land chapter. And in dealing with other authors and colleagues, it seems like everyone's on board about talking about equity issues in terms of equal access to resources, equal access to land. When we talk about equal access to education for women, equal access for women's empowerment, when there's a notion that this has something to do with potentially having an effect on decreasing populations, I somehow often get pushback that this is being prescriptive. And this really does, again, it flummoxes me because, people who are in the population community get this, providing access to education for women. This is a moral imperative in se, or in itself, right? Forget the conservation outcomes. This is an equity issue. And so that it might also have this outcome of reducing population pressures on conservation areas should not preclude us from understanding that this is fundamentally a woman's equality issue, and we should champion it for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Now we're going to turn to Vic Mohan, who, as I mentioned, is still there. Mercifully, the technology continues to work. From London, Vic. Vic, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It feels great to be part of this event, even if I can't be there in person. I just want to do a quick sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can folks in the back hear? Yeah, okay, we're good.
Can you hear me? Great. And can you see my slides? Because they're much prettier than I am.
Okay, yes. One screen, yes. So you look at Vic here and his slides over there. Yes, we have split screen, so go ahead, Vic.
I'll choose the slides every time.
Okay.
I'll make a start. So thank you once again for welcoming me. My name is Vic. As well as being a practicing doctor, I'm the medical director for Blue Ventures Conservation. And I'll be talking about our population health and environment program in this area. So it's very much a first-hand field experience of this sort of work and presenting the PHE model as a possible solution to some of the challenges we've been hearing about today. Now, at the risk of preaching to people who know far more about PHE than I do, this is just a very quick slide to explain what I mean by PHE. So basically, the key message is that PHE is an integrated cross-sector approach. And our PHE program includes conventional biodiversity conservation, conventional conservation programs. It includes women's empowerment initiatives. It includes community health work. It includes community education, particularly women's education, and it includes livelihood diversification programs. We run these programs in an integrated way. And what we find is that by taking an integrated approach, we generate and create synergies which enables us to achieve our different objectives more effectively than had we taken traditional vertical programs such as a pure conservation or a pure health program. I hope that's not too patronising for the audience. And it's a particularly valuable way for working in remote, high biodiverse areas. So you've heard all this information before, so I won't dwell on it, but the key message is that people who live in the biodiversity hotspots are typically poorer, typically have poorer access to healthcare than their counterparts in the cities or in the world at large, and typically have poorer health than those counterparts. And if you look at population growth alone, as we already have heard, population growth in biodiversity hotspots is significantly higher than the global average. Now, we work in Madagascar, one of the world's biodiversity hotspots, and described as one of the hottest of the world's biodiversity hotspots. It's the oldest island in the world, and it's the fourth biggest island, and separated from any continental mainland probably about 150 million years ago. And that isolation has meant that the wildlife that has evolved and inhabits Madagascar is truly unique. So 80% of all the wildlife on Madagascar is endemic. That's a very, very high level of endemism for one country. And its location, its size, and the sheer breadth of habitats that you find on Madagascar means you get a huge amount of biodiversity. So 5% of the world's biodiversity is found in Madagascar. In addition to that, Madagascar is one of the world's poorest countries, and it is defined as one of the world's least developed countries as well. So, some pretty pictures for you now. I regret not being able to see the slides for the previous two presentations, but I've got some nice pictures for you to look at. So this picture is of the Indri, which is the largest of the lemurs in Madagascar. It's a hauntingly beautiful animal. I guess it's the lemurs that have made Madagascar's wildlife so famous. There are about 100 species, all of which are, of course, endemic to Madagascar. But it's not just lemurs that make the mammalian wildlife unique. So 93% of the mammals in Madagascar are found nowhere else in the world. And it's not just mammals. So here we have pictures of two different types of chameleon. The chameleon on the right is a Parsons chameleon, which is about 18 to 20 inches long, if you were to roll it out. That's one of the largest chameleons in the world, and the one on the left will be about small enough to fit on my little finger. And we see huge endemism amongst the reptiles, and we see endemism high endemism amongst all the animals and plants. And so we see about 90% endemism amongst plants. This picture here is of the Grandidier's baobab tree, one of 6 species of baobab tree that's found only in Madagascar. So what of population? So despite significant improvements, access to family planning services remains limited, particularly in the more remote areas. And access to basic health education is probably even more limited. As a result, women are having on average five live births, and the population of the country doubles approximately 20 years. And what impact is that having on the environment? Well, this picture I took on one of my trips recently, and this is the last surviving fragment of rainforest in the entire central plateau of Madagascar. The plateau covers about 1/3 of the country. And the rest of it, as you can see, has been cleared. It's been cleared to support their agricultural practices of slash and burn, of clearing forest to grow rice. And these practices are becoming increasingly unsustainable because of the rapid growth in population that the country is seeing. Now, we work
in the remote southwest of the country, and we work with coastal communities to enable them to manage their marine resources sustainably. Along that coast lies the 4th largest barrier reef in the world. And the biodiversity that you see in the forests of Madagascar is mirrored by the biodiversity that we see in the marine environment. You don't see the same level of endemism, and as a result it hasn't attracted the same attention, but you see incredibly high levels of biodiversity. So we estimate that over 500 species of fish live in that barrier reef, and around 160 hard coral species are found in that barrier reef system. Along the coast inland, we see spiny forest, which is perhaps Madagascar at its most unique. And we see, this is the oldest biome in Madagascar, and we see incredibly high levels of endemism in the spiny forest. The spiny forest harbours the highest levels of plant endemism anywhere in Madagascar. So the southwest is a particularly important area of Madagascar to protect. Now we're based in the remote fishing village of Andavadok. Andavadok is 8 hours travel in a 4x4 from the nearest city. There are no roads, there is no running water, there is no electricity. In a country that is one of the poorest in the world, the subsistence fishermen that live along the coast of the southwest are among some of the most marginalised and isolated in the country. The aerial view shows you it's a very arid land, so these are subsistence fishermen that rely exclusively on the marine environment for their survival. Now, Blue Ventures has enabled the formation of Volundriak, which means to live with the sea. And the Volundriak is a cooperative venture where we work with those coastal communities to enable them to manage their marine resources sustainably. How does that work? Well, conventional conservation interventions such as setting up protected areas, fisheries management, and banning unsustainable and damaging fishing practices. And that coastal resource management, that community-based conservation program, is complemented by a range of other initiatives, all designed to reduce pressure on the marine environment and to enable sustainable use and sustainable development. And those include community education programs, investing particularly in women's health, aquaculture, ecotourism, all designed to reduce pressure on the marine environment. However, that model doesn't take into account the issue of population growth. And being a doctor, I was interested in the health and the health needs of the communities that we partnered with. And just by asking a few very basic questions, we unearthed a huge unmet need for healthcare and a huge unmet need for family planning in particular. So there is no health education in our region at all. And if women or couples want to access basic family planning services, they would have to walk 50 kilometres through the spiny forest to the nearest village, town, and hope that the clinic is open on that day. And that's prohibitively far for the majority of couples. As a result, girls become sexually active as young as 8, they're having children as young as 11, and they're having up to 20 children, or sometimes more in fact. High infant and maternal mortality, high anecdotal prevalence of lots of sexually transmissible infections, and quite apart from the huge health, social and economic impact on that high birth rate, which is higher than the national average, the population was growing so rapidly that in spite of our best conservation efforts, the demand for those finite coastal resources is outstripping supply. And we can see that impact in our fisheries research. So the number of people who are going out to catch fish to feed their families is going up exponentially. And those fishermen are having to work harder and harder to catch smaller fish that are further and further down the food web. And most alarmingly of all, they're beginning to catch increasing numbers of juvenile fish, fish that have not reached sexual maturity and have therefore not had a chance to contribute to fish stock replenishment. So, having unearthed this huge unmet need for family planning services, after engaging in dialogue with the community, we established that the community were desperate for us to provide basic family planning services for them. So in 2007, I flew out to Madagascar, and we opened the doors to the very first family planning clinic in the village of Andavadok. And on the very first day we opened the first clinic in Andavadok, 20% of all women of reproductive age came asking for contraception. So we'd clearly unearthed a huge unmet need, a need that had not previously been expressed to anybody, and a need that probably wasn't documented in any of the data that we've been hearing about. And what we rapidly found is this unmet need was mirrored in every single village along the coast that we worked in. Every single village had the same unmet need. So over the subsequent 4 years, we worked very hard to scale up our intervention. So now, 4 years on, we have a service that meets the family planning needs of all 40 villages that we partner with for our coastal resource management, community-based conservation work. And we have two models of service delivery. We have the traditional clinical model where we have our team go out in boats, there are no roads, they sail from village to village running family planning clinics. And we also have a program of community-based distribution where we recruit, train and supervise community representatives to distribute basic family planning services under clinical supervision. And that way we've managed to meet the needs of the entire village. And of the entire community, I should say. And that program of clinical service is complemented by a very rich program of community education. And the educational programs are designed to raise awareness and empower women and couples to make their own reproductive health choices for the first time. So in this slide, I hope you can see it, the bottom left picture is our group of peer educators reciting poetry about the benefits of using family planning. And the bottom right picture is the first woman in the region to receive a contraceptive implant. And as I said from the beginning, this is an integrated program. We integrate this work into other initiatives. And how does that work on the ground? Well, our health practitioners, our health team, work alongside and collaborate very closely with all of our other project staff. So they share ideas, share resources, share skills, share opportunities, and that allows for real economies of scale. We also train our community representatives across the breadth of the interventions that we offer. So, for example, some of our community-based distributors are trained in community-based monitoring of our marine resources, so they see the links. And our educational messages are delivering increasingly integrated messages. So when we run educational events, we will include messages about coastal resource management, we will include messages about fisheries, we'll include messages about health, we'll include messages about sanitation and hygiene. And so therefore we are able to reach a broader and more diverse message audience with diverse messages, and increasingly those messages are integrated. So for example, some of our fishing communities came up with the idea for a t-shirt design, and the t-shirt says, if we have too many children, there won't be enough fish. So this is a community that clearly is seeing the links between reproductive health, population growth, food security, and biodiversity conservation. And because we offer a range of services for the community that includes health, includes education, includes services that the community really value, we get better buy-in from them for all of the things that we do. And it's these sorts of things that we think create those synergies that enable us to be so much more effective than if we were to take a pure vertical programs. So just a very few, a bit of data on our results. So in 2007, the proportion of women of reproductive age who were using a method of family planning was about 7%. And those are the people that were resourceful enough to walk the 50 kilometres to access those services. And in the 4 years since we've opened the service, that's gone up fourfold. So we've seen a fourfold increase in the proportion of women who are using family planning services. And although we cannot infer causality, what we see is that increase is mirrored by a significant drop in the birth rate, in the fertility rate. So we're seeing a drop in the birth rate by about a third since we first opened the service. And we've calculated that the population is 5% smaller than it would have been had the growth rate stayed the same. So what have we learned? You know what? The most important lesson that we've learned is that initially we were a conservation organisation. And as a conservation organisation, we have learned that it is possible for us to offer family planning services to the community. And we are simply responding to an unmet need for healthcare. Okay? And it's because we're there, it's because we have a physical presence, because we have a strong relationship with the community, we're able to implement that service rapidly and at much lower cost than if we'd started a standalone family planning service. And because we had such good trust in the community, we've enabled massive uptake of this service really, really quickly. And we're seeing the breadth of benefits that it's yielding. Of course we see health and social benefits, but we're also seeing economic and environmental benefits as a result of the intervention that we're offering. And what we think is there's nothing magical about what we're doing. You know, this has been pushing against an open door. And what we think we have here is a model that can be reproduced. Reproduced definitely along the west coast of Madagascar, and reproduced in all areas of high biodiversity, I would imagine, or many of those areas where we're working in remote areas where the population is underserved and there are high unmet needs for these sorts of services, and possibly where conservation practitioners are already operating and have a good understanding of the region and good trust with those communities. So the next steps for us, well, we've already started to diversify our interventions, our health interventions, to make a richer and more comprehensive program. We've started a maternal health program. We've started the water, sanitation and hygiene program, which we think is very important for our community. And we're working on increasingly on women's empowerment for the reasons you've already heard about. We're planning on replicating in other parts of Madagascar, and we're keen to advocate for this integrated approach as much as possible and help to identify situations where that would be possible. And finally, we would like to contribute to the body of research that identifies the benefits of the integrated programming and tries to quantify those benefits in a way that will enable policymakers to make meaningful evidence-based decisions about how this model can be taken to scale. Just leave me to say thank you all again for inviting me. I hope this has worked okay. It feels very bizarre to be talking to a camera, not to an audience. In a former life, I used to be a stand-up comedian, so it's quite weird to not have an audience in front of me, but I hope that you heard me okay, and I hope that's been okay, and I want to thank our sponsors and thank Wilson once again for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Terrific. No, thank you very much, Vic. It worked very well, both with two screens, one to watch you and one to see the slides, and it was clear, and so we really appreciate you and your colleagues staying a bit late, shall we say, to make it possible for you to join us, given the time differences. As part of my introduction of Vic, I should have also mentioned that I hope you will avail yourself of one of our focus briefing paper series, which is meant to capture the field-based lessons learned, one that Vic and two of his colleagues have penned that are available outside in the Wilson Center's focus briefing paper series, as well as some of the shorter videos that we have on our New Security Beat blog that we recorded with Vic in Dakar, Senegal this past year. So thank you very much, Vic. So why don't we throw the floor open for questions? Obviously, we can pose it to the whole panel and have them all join in, or feel free to have a specific one for one of the presentations. Obviously, we intentionally had related but yet some diverse angles on these questions in terms of scale, in terms of what questions were asked specifically, and with Vic particularly in terms of some of the experiences from field-based lessons. As I said up front, we want you to use a microphone so that the folks online can hear, and so Vic can hear your questions, and my colleagues will bring those to you. So who would like to kick us off in terms of the discussion? Okay, we have one down here, Sky.
Hello? Okay. Fascinating talk. Ben Schelk with Blue Legacy International. And, I hate to play devil's advocate here, but, I want to kind of bring this in a different direction here. Assuming, increased population growth in these biodiversity hotspots, we can expect, increased ecological fragmentation of the hotspot areas. Now, assuming that extinction isn't predominant, which is a big assumption, I realize that perhaps I should stop there, but assuming extinction isn't predominant, would we expect, I'm not a biologist either, but would we expect increased speciation and perhaps even greater biodiversity as species continue to adapt to diverse ecological niches?
Okay.
Perhaps, John could address this.
John and David both reached for that microphone in a hurry, so I think they both have something to say.
I think John probably has more expertise in this than I. So I just want to say, I think one thing briefly, that Washington D.C. has more biodiversity than the Appalachians, right?
Yeah.
Some pretty exotic,
so there's something not about biodiversity is one concept, and the other is biological integrity.
Yeah, well, there's certainly the integrity is an important issue, but the going back to sort of one of David's main points of his talk was scale, and in this case it's a time scale, and if you're thinking about, certainly if patches are isolated, like if you take the Indonesian archipelago, that is a crucible for speciation, but the time scales we're talking about there that led to that diversity are tens of millions of years. And we're doing this all in the time since the Industrial Revolution began. And so that doesn't give the kind of time frame necessary for speciation to happen and for animals to adapt.
Well, obviously there have been cases of rapid, perhaps not speciation, but, adaptation of species to, pollution, and everything like that. But, yeah, obviously extinction, I think, would overshadow the effect, in the short term of long-term speciation.
How many colors of cockroach do you want?
Yeah. Bacteria and viruses stand to do quite well, but things with larger life cycles, I think, longer life cycles, I think, are going to suffer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Why don't we work down the aisle there? We got another question right there.
Yes, my name is Brian Hansen. I'm a graduate student at George Mason, so thanks to the panel and the Woodrow Wilson Center for setting this up today. I have two questions for Mr. Lopez, Mr. Williams. What impact do you see in China, and specifically southwest China, in their mountainous area there, with the government controls on population growth? What impacts have you seen on the environment in that biodiverse area? And then for Dr. Mohan, I'm curious, the government of Madagascar, has your organization received any kind of feedback or pushback or positive messages from the government in respect to the work that your organization is doing there on the western coast of Madagascar? Thank you.
Yeah, and Vic, when you answer that, perhaps you could contrast whether there are big changes before or after the change in government. Yeah, why don't you go first, and then we'll have David and John.
Thank you for your question. It's a very important question, because if we're to assure the sustainability of what we do, we need to make sure we have the support of, and we work alongside government initiatives. And we're pleased to say that we have full government backing for our work across the breadth of our interventions. So that includes our conservation work, and it includes our integrated program, and it includes our sexual reproductive health programs, etc. So we have full government backing. The problem that the people of our region have is that it's so remote. We're so isolated. We're 8 hours travel from the nearest city. Actually, whatever happens in central government has very little bearing on what goes on in our region. And no one's managed to reach our region before because of its remoteness. So we've the political coup of Madagascar in 2009 had a destabilising influence on us because of difficulty in securing supplies and this sort of thing. But it had very little bearing on our implementation on the ground. And both before and after the coup, we've managed to maintain sufficiently good relationships with the government to allow us to continue our work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Gentlemen, want to take on China question?
Okay. Yeah, my Chinese geography is not very good, but the one thing I will say about the mountains of southwest China, I did actually take a specific look at that, because part of the problem, again, with scale is when you have administrative units, sometimes you have a hotspot that straddles a very rural area with a very sparse population and a city, and so you get a number that's representative of neither. And in the case of the mountains of southwest China, I believe it's Chengdu. It's right on the edge of that. And if you include Chengdu, you get a very different picture than you do for sort of the rural areas. And just looking at the rural areas, the growth rates are relatively modest. But sort of what are the pressures from that city? What are the demands? Sort of I think the challenge in answering that question would be to try to separate what are the sort of pressures on biodiversity that are going to meet the immediate sort of survival needs of the people of the rural population living there, versus maybe more the I wouldn't call it luxury, but sort of less immediate needs of a higher income population of a city or an urban area like Chengdu.
David, maybe since that is a similar challenge that you've had in Guatemala in teasing out the impacts of, in an overall country level, very declining population growth, but some of those communities, indigenous communities, maintaining still relatively high TFRs. And so that consumption from the cities versus the livelihood survivalist pressures, do you have general rules of thumb on how to try to tease that out?
No, is the short answer. It's such an important, fascinating, difficult question to answer adequately. Let me try to kind of frame this in one way I look at it, in that there's a reason why we don't see a lot of PhD literature, frankly, in academic journals. Because to actually make these links, with statistical rigor, is hard to do in a lot of circumstances. And that's true for scale issues, but it's also true because of the nature of demographic and development transitions. So here's kind of one, if we're talking about a rule of thumb, it's very hard to be so reductionist, but, in one thing that is certainly going on right now that is unusual and unprecedented historically is that we have demographic, health, and then you have the subcomponents to these, like mortality and urban transition, right? And they're happening vertiginously and heterogeneously across the planet. So you have places like Central Africa, for example, that has scarcely begun the demographic transition. So this would have been tantamount to Europe or North America hundreds of years ago, a few hundred years ago. And then collapsing space. You can go, a few hundred miles to the south in South Africa. You can be in Cape Town, and they have a TFR below 2. So this is what's going on in the world right now. And so how do you link those then to conservation and land change and things like that? It's very difficult. And that's one of the reasons why when I started to do this work back in the early to mid-'90s, working on my dissertation, I specifically chose places where it's remote, rural, humans interact intimately in time and space with the environment. And that is, it's never that simple, but to the extent where you're working in a place where people are subsistence or semi-subsistence farmers, there you can sometimes say something very directly and with some statistical certitude about relationships between population dynamics, structure, change, and environmental change right there, right then. Now, very few places, though, are truly, a subsistence economy any longer. So these things, the global forces make it very complex. And so, yes, sometimes you can isolate or get close to isolating these population-environment interactions intimately in time and space. But increasingly, with these transitions happening, it's very complex. And so I don't want to take too long on this topic, but it's hard to unpack. And so I can just give one other example that I think is fascinating in this. We, for a part of a National Science Foundation Coupled Natural Human Systems grant that we're in the last year right now, we asked the question, well, for Latin America, is there a statistical relationship between population change over the last decade, more or less, 2000, 2010, and deforestation, land change? We have data, population data from all of the 16,000 plus municipalities for Latin America. We have arguably the best land classification data at the continent level ever created every year, 2000, 2010. And we've done all sorts of fancy modeling to try to tease this out, and we keep getting zero relationship between population change and land change. Why? Why? Well, I can go on for too long on this, so I won't do that. But I will say this just briefly, that what we're seeing is that it's not related. It's increasingly not related intimately in space and time, as you would see, for example, in an agricultural frontier, right? But increasingly, it's separated in space and time, so that most of the deforestation the dramatic deforestation that we see in Latin America is going on in southern Brazil, Paraguay. Soybean expansion. Is it because of population growth locally? No, heck, on the contrary. This is high-intensity farming. There are fewer farmers. I mean, farmers have been displaced. You have lower population in these places than you had before. So actually, if anything, in some places, it's decreasing population, greater forced conversion. But where are the soybeans going? They're going to feed the urban consumers in China that are increasingly eating poultry, increasingly eating pork, and they're being fed with the soybeans that are being produced in Brazil. So we see that pattern very, very related to a population dynamic, urbanization in China, but very removed in space and time. Then we have other places like in the Arc of the Andes or in Central America, where I do a lot of my work, where still, yes, you have subsistence farmers, high fertility rates, and where on the production and demand side, fertility is often related to, and Jason Bremner's works for sure, and on the Amazon is intimately related with land changes.
Okay. Dan, Martin? Somebody's been working on biodiversity for a little while?
Yeah. Well, I think that discussion illustrates the difficulty, perhaps even the value of these generalizations. But I wanted to comment on the Chinese case out of some experience because it was so contrary to those assumptions about subsistence economies, agriculture or fishing or whatever. And in Yunnan, in southern Yunnan, where there's truly a tropical forest structure, there was a decision taken by the central government in Beijing, by the best experts, best economists, that China needed a domestic supply of natural rubber. In order to accomplish that, they tore down a lot of forest, natural tropical forest in southern Yunnan near the border with Laos. The result was, because it was not quite warm enough in southern Yunnan, the rubber plantations on north-facing slopes died. The rubber plantations on south-facing slopes survived. And the domestic rubber supply that resulted was estimated to cost about twice the world market price. So the geniuses in the agriculture ministry in Beijing had an impact that is completely unrelated to any subsistence economy. Similarly, in the same area, because the national government in China did not apply the one-child policy to the minority groups that live there, that are not Han people. In fact, they've made the nationalities and their cultures around the fringes of Yunnan into a tourist attraction, and a huge museum of nationalities in Kunming. Population grew there faster than other parts of China simply because those people were exempted from the one-child policy. So the point really is what's local is real, and what's statistically significant may not be.
I think, Dan, if you can hand it over to Jim in the middle, we'll pick up his question too.
Jim Nations with National Parks Conservation Association. I want to, with the floor, ask one quick question and then one longer discussion. To Vic, I noticed you had funding there from UNFPA, MacArthur Foundation, USAID. Do you have plans to scale up, which continues to be one of the challenges of a very successful model? Have you thought about how you're going to scale it up, and do you have sufficient funding to do that?
We're getting to a position now where we think we've developed expertise, we think we've developed a model that we think we can start to replicate. So we are looking at one or two other sites along the west coast of Madagascar, where we already have an interest in marine conservation, where we could replicate this model. And Whether we can do that will depend on whether we can attract the funding for that, and we're currently pursuing that objective. And then once we've replicated it in 2 or 3 sites within Madagascar, we would be interested in either replicating it ourselves or working with other conservation organisations to enable them to replicate this model. So we would love to. We would love to. Watch this space.
I suspect you could draw on anybody in this room for reference letters if you need support. The discussion question would go to David, following on your statement about being flummoxed by some of the responses that you get and the inability to publish in academic journals on some of these issues. And I've noticed that when I talk to some of my 20-something and 30-something colleagues and I mention the word human population growth, they will look me right in the eye and say, it's not population, it's consumption. It makes me wonder a couple of things. Is that what our colleagues are teaching in the universities now, that it's not about population, it's about consumption? It's almost a guilt trip on the United States and the Western world a little bit. But more than that, can you give me an elevator speech to respond to that? Because without a whiteboard in 20 minutes, I'm flummoxed by it. You know, I can say I equals PAT, and they say it's about consumption. Get out of here.
Practicing professor, you want to...
I appreciate your sharing that. To be more specific than just saying flummoxed, I mean, it's just an inherent illogic. You know, on the one hand, again, basing discussions of human-environment interactions on issues of equity, land equity, resource equity. No, people have no problem with this. And when I say, what about women's equity? What about educational equity? Okay, fine, as long as that is not leading towards, policy that might, ask women to have fewer children. People don't get it. And what is particular? So when I try to give like the elevator talk, I do try to just say right off, well, women, when given the choice, as John said, and as many people here already know, will choose to have fewer children if they're given that choice, and that's a good thing. And it's not just a good thing; it's a moral imperative. It's something about equality, human equality, human justice, and I think that may or may not have beneficial ecological consequences in certain places at certain times, but over time, it probably overall has a beneficial impact. Again, where I put this to the floor, where I have a hard time really is when I say that, and people still, they seem sort of rigid. And of course it is consumption, and consumption is huge, increasingly so. But there's no consumption without population. They're both factors. It's a relative. It's a relative. It's not an either or. It's a relative. And so how do we get around this to get people out of that to being so intransigent, to understand that, well, it's not an either or, it's relative. And it's okay if women are empowered and want to have fewer kids. That's okay. It's okay. It's okay if eventually that they choose then to have fewer children. I mean, and what I really don't understand is how people can continue to sort of view this as something that's coercive when, people who know population in the population public health community, I mean, that's 20 years ago, or more, we're so far beyond that, yet so many people that don't do population, it's like a dirty word to say population. I really do. I just put it on the floor because, is there something we can do? I don't know.
Can I just add one little thing to that, Jim? I would say for your elevator speech, that study, that Imhoff graphic I showed you, which was the net that Taylor Ricketts was also part of, that net primary human appropriation of net primary productivity. That's basically our use of plants and every sort of the energy that we capture on this planet from the sun, and we're using 35% of it. And we're a species whose biomass is 0.5%. And that maps very closely with the distribution of population on the globe.
I'll make an editorial comment. I think in part the challenge has been because we're so interested in public discourse in either ors. It's one or the other, and of course it's both. And we're also so interested in saying which one's more important, and so therefore it's biggest, and therefore your other one that's also part of the equation is less important, so therefore you only do one and not the other. And then that unfortunately has historically mapped on to the kind of reductionist explanation for north-south discussions in any, say, UN forum. You consume too much, there are too many of you. And so it fits into that equity or unequal relationship that also, kind of David said, well, if you know population, that's a pre-Cairo view of focusing just on numbers and the coercive history. I think if you know population, obviously there's not a widespread knowledge, and part of this is about communicating across disciplines, knowing each other's histories, knowing each other's tools, where we are and where we aren't. So in some sense, a lot of that is finding ways to teach that history, finding ways to navigate a rights-focused conversation of this that explicitly recognizes, because of those challenges of history, we have to take extra steps to put it in a rights terms, in a demand-driven terms, in ways that avoid oversimplification and kind of headline versions of this. But yes, I think we all face this challenge. I mean, for me, there's an analogy working in areas of linking environment and security together, too. You have the same, well, all environment are just tree huggers and all security people just want to blow stuff up. And, of course, where there's pieces of truth in both, it actually misses a whole bunch of diversity. Jason and Ed had questions, if we can come on that side. Come to Janet.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff, for following up on that double espresso crazed idea that we had only a year ago. So it didn't take you that long, and I appreciate that. And I thought that the three talks fit together really well. And I appreciate the complexity with which David and John are addressing the topic. I think that one thing that's really exposed here, and that I think we need to focus on, especially among conservation community, and maybe more broadly among the environment community, is this kind of myth of urbanization, and this idea that most population growth in the world in the future will happen in urban places. There's this idea that, oh, well, the world is urbanizing, and that means less people in rural places, and if we figure out the consumption issue, that everything's going to be okay for biodiversity, because there aren't going to be that many people out there. And I think that, John, your work showing just over the last 10 years that that the biodiversity hotspots have grown by 350 million, is contrary to that idea. And David, you're showing the health indicators and saying it's going to be a long time before we even see slowing growth in these areas as another support of that. And so I might, wonder, how do we get across this idea that growth is continuing, that of that the difference of 7 billion to 9 billion by 2050, that a lot of that will be happening in these places, these very places. And then, Jim, that gets to kind of your idea of how do I inform people about that? You say, okay, let's not talk about climate change. Let's just talk about protected areas and where growth is going to occur. It's going to occur there, and we have to ask ourselves, what's the impact of that going to be? I don't really know if, can you take this data and not make it more statistical, but just draw the messages out of that to try to get that basic point across?
Right, Jason, if you could hand it over to Ed, because I see a number of hands in declining amount of time. Why don't we capture a couple and then give people a chance to respond?
Yeah, Ed Berry with Sustainable World Initiative. My question is for Vic, if you can hear me. Hello?
I can hear you.
Good, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Went out for
and my question has to do with, if you can take your program in one community to scale and run it all up and down the coast, I still get a sense that that's not sustainable in the way you portrayed the total island. and that is that humanity is already totally overusing the resources or the biocapacity of that island, of that land area. And so my question is, would you agree with that? And if so, how do you stop the encroachment from the rest of the urban centers and the total human need there for resources? And has anybody looked at what a sustainable population might be for Madagascar?
Okay. And Janet, I think, had a question. We get it across there.
I know Tanya has a question, but I'll slip one in quick for Vic. I'm Janet Edmond from Conservation International, and I know our marine program has been hearing a lot about you, and they're very interested in your model. So there's one target for reproducing your model. And also, I just wanted to ask quickly, are you collecting data? Because we've heard a lot about the need for the data, especially on the gender roles and how those are changing through your PhD program, because I think that's a really important point that you highlighted. I was a little surprised to see how strongly it came through, but I think we need more data within the PhD community for that.
Okay. Vic, should we start with you with those two questions from both Janet and Ed?
Yeah, so I'll take the last question first. Yes, we are gathering data. We're gathering data across the breadth of our different interventions, health data, biodiversity conservation data, fisheries data, etc. We're not gathering very much data specifically on how gender roles are changing as a result, but what we are hoping to measure is whether women's participation in activities other than purely being the mother in the family is increasing, whether their participation in biodiversity conservation, whether they become more active within their communities is increasing. We're hoping to measure that. So I hope, I totally agree with you. You know, we need to gather really good data and produce really good evidence to demonstrate that what we say happens really does happen, that integration does mean more effective achievement of outcomes. So I agree with you entirely. The second question was about, is this truly a sustainable model if you look at the bigger picture of population growth, etc. in Madagascar? Was that right? Have I got that right? Yeah?
Yep.
So I'm afraid I really don't have the data to be able to answer that question really accurately. You know, what we see along the coast, for example, is a big migration to the coast as a result of population growth inland. And the people that come to the coast bring with them fishing practices that are far less sustainable and far more damaging than the people who've grown up along the coast, who are artisanal fishermen. So that already brings in an element of unsustainability potentially to the work that we're doing. So we work with the entire coastal communities to enable them to ensure that those things don't happen, but that already brings the threat of unsustainability into what we hope was a sustainable model. In terms of whether anybody's done the calculations on how many people Madagascar could sustain, I'm afraid I don't know. But we do have to take into account migration. Increasing numbers of people migrating to coastal areas and people migrating up and down the coast where fisheries will be better or poorer, depending on where coastal populations are. What we see is a direct correlation between coastal population density and the integrity of the marine environment. So inevitably people are going to move to more remote, more biodiverse coastal regions. So we have to take into account migration as well. I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that question. It's a really important one. I'm afraid I'm just not clever enough.
Vic, can I ask a follow-up? Because I'm not sure, I don't know the answer to it, but I thought I understood that one of the additional ways to bring resources, both human and financial, to your efforts is the use of essentially the kind of ecotourism and bringing people in to see the conservation, but also then putting them to work. And so both generating income for what you're doing and generating additional capacity. Can you say a word about how you are using that?
Yeah, so I skimmed over that in my talk, but Blue Ventures Conservation sits alongside Blue Ventures Expeditions, which is a social enterprise where we take paying volunteers to go and contribute to our fisheries research, to our conservation work. And they are paying volunteers, and as well as taking part in conservation and producing good data,
the income generated pays for some of our conservation work. So we have a sort of a diversity of financial models to ensure financial sustainability of our work. And we think that's one model we could use to upscale the work we do by bringing more ecotourism into the region.
Okay, terrific. David or John, any thoughts or comments on Jason's point? It's perhaps more comment than question, but.
I mean, yeah, that's a quick comment. I mean, this is another issue that I think is hard to communicate to the public. And in fact, even you know, I find that very few academics fully understand that if we look at UN projections going forward, if we say, you know, go up as far as 2100, well, going forward, it's if you just look at the projections, I think that all of the world's net growth, right, will be in the world's poorest cities. Yeah. But here's the complexity of that. Virtually all of that growth will be predicated upon the timing, magnitude, pace of the fertility transition in rural areas. Because, you know, the fertility transition is expedited once people move to cities. And so virtually all this growth is going to be from migration, fueled by remaining high fertility in rural areas. And as we talked about the last time you and I gave a talk here, Jason, we don't know. We don't know where the fertility rates are highest is where we have the least data and thus know the least about what's going on with those transitions. So whether we have 9 or 10 or 11 billion people, yeah, it's more, what we're pretty certain about is that these people are going to end up in cities. Most of these people are going to end up in cities, poor cities. What we know much less about and the UN projections belie this point is what is the timing, magnitude, location, you know, of these transitions? Will there be 8, 9, 10, 11 billion people? Because those transitions in the most remote rural areas where we don't have the data are precisely where, you know, they're most stalled.
Just a quick comment on Vic's response. I just want to say that I think you're saying that you're unable to answer the question about sort of the sustainable population size of Madagascar. It's not just being unable; it's an actually impossible question to answer because sustainable depends on what your definition is. I mean, when I was last in Madagascar in 2003, the population was 7 million people fewer, and so. There's so much endemism on that island that just in that time and that population difference, undoubtedly, many species have been lost. And so sustainable is a question of what we consider acceptable and sustainable for whom? For humans? It's probably a much higher number than it is if we want to think about the endemic biodiversity of Madagascar.
Okay, there are 2 questions down the way here. Don't want to neglect them.
Hi, I'm Tanya Raw from CARE USA, and I'm going to take our conversation back just to the question about population and consumption and the pushback that you might get, David. And I'm coming from the perspective of a development organization and a women's empowerment organization, and just want to put a couple different ideas on the table. On the population consumption question, I think part of the challenge is the difficulty of talking about natural resource management and biodiversity conservation versus talking about climate change, because they're obviously related, but the ways of addressing them aren't necessarily the same. And so for me, when we talk about population and climate change, that's when I immediately do come back to consumption, because it isn't necessarily, you know, the woman in Malawi and her children whose carbon footprint is, you know, 1/29th, unfortunately, the size of mine. That's just a nuance to the conversation that's difficult when everything these days is boiled down to 30-second sound bites. In terms of the pushback you might get in talking about population, family planning, and biodiversity hotspots, I think some of that comes from how we characterize our motivation for talking about that. From a development organization's perspective, we talk about family planning and women's empowerment and gender equality because those things have intrinsic value. Our motivation starts with just a very basic rights-based approach. a woman has a right to be equal to her husband or her son or her father or brother, full stop. The fact that it also has conservation benefits is a useful argument in an advocacy context. You know, these days on Capitol Hill, you need every argument you can get, because a conservation advocate may not be a family planning advocate. But if a conservation organization goes in to talk to that person and says, well, look, you value biodiversity, but you don't support family planning, the family planning community might have another champion on its hands. So a lot of it is just how we talk about why we're pushing for different things. And at a community level, because population and family planning often stem from power dynamics and inherent inequality between men and women, it's important that those things are pushed for their own intrinsic value rather than because it minimizes how much firewood women collect from, you know, the forest or whatnot. So, you know, I really appreciate the growing amount of dialogue about the population, you know, family planning, climate change, natural resource management, all of those linkages, because I think it's incredibly important to keep the open dialogue going so both sides understand the issues as well as the motivations. So thank you for having this.
Great. If you could just hand it down to persons.
Thank you very much. Kate Anderson, also from George Mason University. My question firstly goes to Vic, and would love to hear also anything from David and John in your experience with CI and WWF. But previously in your discussion, you mentioned that you've taken the last 4 or so years of results and data for policy recommendations. And I'm curious, to whom are those policy recommendations made and what are they? And again, would love to hear from any of the panel on that.
Okay. Vic, why don't we have you again start, and what will be our last set of interventions from the panelists?
Sorry, perhaps I miscommunicated that. We're not at a stage where we're offering our data up in order to influence policy yet. What we're doing is we're gathering data to demonstrate the effectiveness of our program, and hopefully ultimately to demonstrate the effectiveness of an integrated approach. Once we have that data, we may well move into the world of policy. At the moment, we're just gathering data to demonstrate the effectiveness of what we do. In an ideal world, I would love to be influencing policy at all levels to enable more integrated working across different sectors, whether that's country or international, international policy. So we're not at the stage where we're doing that at the moment, but we'd love to be influencing policy where people think about developing and running integrated programs. I hope that answers your question.
John and David, any final reflections?
I just add one more question to it, actually, Vic. What is the sort of the receptiveness of the current government to these ideas?
Well, they're very receptive, actually. They very much like our community-based conservation interventions. They really value that, and some of our interventions have now become replicated in other parts of Madagascar through the government. So that's great. And they remain very receptive to our integrated programming and remain very receptive to our health work, our reproductive health work, our maternal health work, because they recognise that nobody else thus far, including the government, has managed to reach the communities that we've managed to reach with our work. No one else has reached this community. And it's our physical presence and good relationship with the community that has enabled us to do that. So we're doing the work for them in many ways. They're very receptive. Does that answer your question?
Good.
Thanks.
Well, it's been a very rich conversation. We've come to the end of the time. Obviously, lots more to continue to discuss. We hope that you will come back to the center, come certainly to the center's website, as well as the other resources that we have in the room with the Balanced Project and PRB and CI and all the partners we worked with a long time who are both on the dais here, but in the audience as well. Please join me in thanking our 3 presenters, and Vic particularly for staying late and doing it at VTC.